From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
He's looking to extend his lifelong career as a prosecutor.
I'm running because when Donald Trump told me in March that my work for the people of Rhode Island was over, Shelley and I decided that it wasn't.
Former U.S. Attorney for Rhode Island Peter Neronha, now a Democratic candidate for Rhode Island Attorney General. Running for public office is dramatically different from being appointed to one. Where does the longtime prosecutor stand on the issues facing the office of the Attorney General? Our guest this week on Newsmakers, Peter Neronha. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Ted Nesi is off this week, so joining us on the program from Rhode Island Public Radio, Ian Donis. Peter, welcome back to the show. It's good to have you.
Thanks. Glad to be back.
A bit of a different role. You used to be here as a U.S. attorney. Now you're a candidate.
Right. Yeah, it's good to see you guys again.
So my first question is, why do you want to be Attorney General?
You know, look, for the last 20 years, I've had one client, the people of the state of Rhode Island, and that has been the best 20 years of my professional career. There's been no better, greater privilege for me. And I just believe that there's a lot of work left to be done that I was doing when I was U.S. Attorney that's not finished yet. It's why I alluded to that when I announced. We've got more public corruption work to do. The Attorney General, the next Attorney General, has to focus on that for reasons I'm sure we'll get into. The opioid work has to continue. We've got to put together a good program on violent crime. And I really think that that the civil division of the Attorney General's office, particularly as the Justice Department in Washington gets out of some areas that they traditionally filled, like civil rights and the environment, is going to really need to step up. And I think, frankly, attorneys general across the country, as we're seeing, I think nationally, need to be in a position to push back on the Trump administration on some areas that I really care about. So that's why I'm running.
So we're going to hit up a lot of those things that you just rattled off there. But the first topic I want to start with, and believe me, 38 Studios, you know, a lot of us in the media are sick of talking about it, but there are very real issues that are facing the Office of the Attorney General when it comes to 38 Studios. And I want to first talk about the release of documents. Right. Part of the materials that are now in the custody of the state are from the U.S. Attorney's Office that were handed over as part of the federal investigation that happened early on, looking mainly into banking laws and whatnot, including grand jury material. How would you feel about the release of that information that happened under your tenure?
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about 38 Studios, I think before you sort of get into the weeds, you got to take a step back and understand, I think, frankly, sort of the lay of the land, if you will. So, look, the problem with 38 Studios, the fundamental problem with 38 Studios, right, is that it was a highly secretive, really ill-advised decision, right? So let's just start with those two points. That's what I think makes this so frustrating for everybody. That's why people want to know what happened. The secrecy prevents us from understanding why this decision was so ill-advised. Now, if that ill-advised decision had been criminal, right, the criminal justice system kind of plays out in a way so that a lot of the material gets exposed. The problem, of course, is that when it is put in a grand jury, as apparently it was done with the state, and as we did with the feds, the U.S. Attorney's Office, you know, you run into this headwind of what the law is, right? And that law does not move easily. In fact, grand jury law, as you know, you've reported on this, really is the very definition of non-transparency, right? So you've got this principle of the grand jury law kind of fighting against this real concern about transparency in the context of a very secretive decision. There are some really good reasons for that grand jury secrecy. I've done a lot of grand jury work personally over the years. We had a lot of grand jury cases while I was U.S. Attorney, and I could run them off. There was the town administrator in Lincoln. There was the conspiracy to bribe the Speaker of the House.
So that's my question. You've done grand jury work there, including 38 Studios.
Right.
Are you okay with federal grand jury material being released?
So let me get to the answer. So you've got to go through the process, and when you read Judge Gibney's decision, and I suspect, and the grand jury is not an arm of the Attorney General. It's not an arm of the U.S. Attorney. It's an arm of the court. You have to go to the court. And so when you read Judge Gibney's decision, whether the U.S. Attorney wants that material released or not, whether the Attorney General wants that material released or not, ultimately it's the court's decision. And when you read Judge Gibney's decision, and I read it several months ago, I read it again over the weekend. When you read that decision, you run into that headwind of the law that I'm talking about. So what's the solution? So, you know, you never stop and say, look, we've got this legal problem. What's the solution? I thought for years. It goes back to the Cornell Young days when I was in the AG's office. I've thought about it at times when I was the U.S. Attorney. There are times when there are cases that you do that you can indict, and I just listed them. You get to tell your story when the mayor of Central Falls takes a bribe. You get to tell the story when the Speaker of the House takes a bribe.
When they get charged.
Yeah, when they get charged. You get to tell the story. But there are many other cases where you don't get to tell the story, either because there's not enough information to charge criminally, or because it's just the case just isn't there, and that leaves prosecutors frustrated too. I mean, there have been many times when we've investigated stuff, either me personally or when the office investigated things, and you know that if you can get the information out there, you might be able to work.
So before we run out of time on this show, is this a story that is worth being told? Then that's fundamentally the question to you.
And I'm going to say now exactly how you tell it, right? There is a mechanism in the law that other states have, and I think we need to consider, which is the grand jury report. Okay, and it accomplishes all of these things that we're talking about, right? What is a grand jury report? The grand jury looks at the material with a benefit of the prosecutor and does a report. There are no charges, but reports on what they found and makes recommendations about how things can improve. And they go to the court for permission to issue that report. And the people who are implicated, right? I don't mean implicated in a crime, but who testified before the grand jury, who may not even be targets, have an opportunity to object. And under those circumstances, the story gets out in a way that protects everyone's interest. And we have never had that law here. And I think it may be time. In fact, I'm convinced it is time to have such a law. I think that accomplishes all of the things we're talking about. It protects the right of people who testify in the grand jury. It protects the rights of people who aren't ultimately charged. But in the right case, in 38 Studios, in my belief, is the right case, the story gets out.
Hang on one second, Ian. Just as a follow-up question, very briefly, would that law then be retroactive to 38 Studios?
I think it could be. I don't see why it couldn't.
Okay, Ian.
Peter Kilmartin was a state rep for 20 years. Before he became Attorney General, he was in the House when the money flowed for the deal used to fund 38 Studios. Should he have recused himself from the 38 Studios investigation?
Right. I mean, that's a question I've gotten several times, and I think ultimately that's a question that the Attorney General himself has to answer.
What do you think?
Had I been in that position, I might have treated it differently. I had a very light trigger when it came to conflicts when I was U.S. Attorney, and I've said this before. I have a sister-in-law who works for Blue Cross. I was recused from every case, not where Blue Cross might be a target, where Blue Cross was a victim. I think whether or not you have a conflict or not is only half of the issue. The other half of the issue is there an appearance of conflict? And in this state, okay, where there is there's a lack of trust, let's face it. And we've talked about it. I've talked about it at the press conferences we did in those corruption cases I did. You know, there really has to be not only a lack of a conflict, but a lack of appearance of a conflict. And I like to think that based on my background, with the cases that we brought when I was U.S. Attorney, and frankly, my lack of political ties in this state, that as Attorney General, I could discharge those duties in a way which I would hope would bring some credibility to the decisions that we make.
You mentioned the lack of trust on the part of the public in Rhode Island. Does that show the need for an independent investigation into how 38 Studios happened?
You know, and that's a tough question. A lot of it depends on what that independent investigator looks like. So, you know, I spoke to some folks the other day about, they were interested in the special prosecutor, Bob Mueller, and I have a background in that. I know the players in that investigation. And so there, where the special prosecutor has all the powers of a U.S. attorney, right? So if you go right to the special counsel statute, the special counsel has all the powers of the U.S. attorney. Well, then a special prosecutor investigator can accomplish something, I think, fairly productive. If the special counsel or the independent investigator doesn't have those powers, maybe not so much, right? If you can't use the grand jury, if you can't immunize a witness, how do you get the truth out? So I think a lot of it depends on the powers of the special prosecutor. But what I come back to is this. If you've got a well-running office, a well-running Attorney General's office, with an Attorney General who has the independence and the experience to do those kinds of cases, you shouldn't need one.
And I just want to follow up with Ian real quick before we move on from this topic. It sounds like you would have recused yourself, is what you're saying, if you were in Peter Kilmartin's
Yeah, I mean,
position.
look, I haven't served in the legislature, but I would be very careful about not creating an appearance of conflict.
All right, let's move on to public corruption. You made that front and center in your announcement speech down in Jamestown the other week, and there is certainly a series of cases that you handled as U.S. Attorney. Traditionally, corruption cases do go the federal route. That's what we've seen around here, often because I've heard that federal laws are better designed to handle it and the consequences are more severe. Now, there have been some appellate decisions, and I don't want to litigate all that that might change it, but would you push for better state laws like a theft of services bill, or do you think the current state laws have been underutilized?
Well, I think we have the laws to do the job.
What, obtaining money under false pretenses?
Yeah, there's a bribery statute and a kickback statute in Rhode Island.
So we haven't been using them?
Well, we used them when I did the John Oster case years ago. We were pretty aggressive when I was U.S. Attorney. Maybe we occupied the field. But there's no reason why an Attorney General who has the will and the experience and the independence to do those cases can't do them. The state police do a really good job on those cases. I've worked with them on those cases. We worked with them when I was U.S. Attorney.
A lot of their work goes to the U.S. Attorney's office.
Yeah, but there's no reason an AG who builds a strong relationship with the state police can't do those cases. I'm absolutely convinced that he or she can. And that is something that would be the top priority for me, and I would really work hard to build those relationships, which frankly I already have in place.
You've talked about working more closely with two state agencies, the Board of Elections and the Ethics Commission, on corruption cases. What would that look like?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of new laws passed now, right, with the auditing, the random auditing of the campaign finance reports, right? So that could generate leads. It's really important that you have a kind of relationship with all of your law enforcement partners that you're talking on a regular basis. So what do I mean by that? As I sort of viewed that landscape over the last few years, it appears like the Board of Elections and the Ethics Commission and the AG's office are a little siloed, so they work almost independently. I don't know that for certain. I'm not in the weeds on that, but as I envision that relationship, it's a regular intersection. It's a regular set of communications. My thing was, when I was U.S. Attorney, I met monthly with the Attorney General. I met monthly with the head of the state police. I met monthly with Commissioner Perry, because I wanted to know, and they wanted to know from me, what was important, what we were working on. And when you build those kinds of relationships, you can really do a lot of good work.
You never know who you might have to go after in the context of public corruption down the road. And I'm wondering if you will accept donations from other elected officials in the state, knowing you could be a prosecutor that has to go after them.
I haven't given that a ton of thought, frankly, yet, Tim. I mean, we just announced last week, but I will say this, that every decision I make as Attorney General will be just like every decision I made as U.S. Attorney. I'm going to do the right thing, and it doesn't matter who's involved in the case. We're going to call them like we see them. We're going to do exactly the right thing. That's the only way I know how to do that job. As soon as you move off that, even for an instant, you're lost. And so that's the compass. That's the true north. Do the right thing. Figure out what the facts are and do the right thing. It doesn't matter who's involved in the case.
I have to go to a break in 1 minute, so I'm going to, for this segment, I'm going to end where we began, and that's back at 38 Studios. I watched your interview with Dan York on his show State of Mind, and you said that you want to review the 38 Studios investigation again if you become Attorney General. You want to take a look at the stuff you haven't been able to see. So my question is, does that signal a lack of confidence on your part with the work that was done?
No, it doesn't, because I don't know all the details of what they did. I wasn't on their Rule 6, their grand jury list. But it's just like when I took over as U.S. Attorney. I was in the office, but I didn't know everything my colleagues were doing in the office. We had some big cases at the time. I really wanted to familiarize myself with even cases that ultimately didn't go anywhere. I wanted to make sure that we made the right call there. And I think given where 38 Studios is and frankly the lack of trust in the outcome across all levels in that scenario, I think it makes sense for me to take a look myself.
Peter Neronha is a Democratic candidate for Attorney General. We'll continue our conversation when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my left, filling in for Ted Nesi, is Ian Donis from Rhode Island Public Radio, and our guest this week is Democratic candidate for Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Neronha. Peter, we talked a lot about criminal. It always gets the focus in these campaigns, but there's also the civil division, and there's a lot of moving parts over the Attorney General's office. As U.S. Attorney, you were able to lure top-notch lawyers away from the Attorney General's office. I think of Bill Furland, I think of Paul Daley, they come to mind. And now you're on the other side of those moves, or you would be if you won. Pension and longevity changes are making it harder to retain top-tier career prosecutors. Over the Attorney General's office, you have Patrick Youngs, Jerry Coyne, Jim Baum. There are many others I'm not mentioning. And it's going to be harder to hold on to them. What can you do to make sure, if you become Attorney General, that kind of experience doesn't slip away?
Yeah, well, I think you have to be realistic and know that you're going to have a lot of young lawyers on your staff, on your team, right? And you just have to accept that as a premise. And so knowing that, you've got to really you got to supervise them really well. What that really means is the people who do have the experience. You've got to make sure that the work that they're doing is important to them and that they get motivated by. When I left a large Boston law firm after 7 years in Boston to go to the AG's office, I didn't go there because the money was better. I went there because I loved the work. And so if you give people work that they love, they'll keep doing it. But you know going in that the number of people you're going to have with experience is going to be relatively few. So you've got to have those folks in a position to really train your young people and try to grow your young people as quickly as possible.
Is pension reform and longevity, do you think that's hurting? And that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I don't know how it couldn't, right? But you know, the bottom line is most people who do that job do it for something other than the financial end of it. They do it because they love the work. And I think you mentioned a bunch of names. You know, the U.S. Attorney's Office, pays better. I mean, that's the reality of it. But I don't know if those people would have gone anywhere else, right? Because they love the work. So I think you're going to have a young staff by and large. That means you got to train them well. You got to have good supervisors who actively supervise. You can't sort of send them over to district court and forget about them. You've got to get over there and make sure that they're learning. That's good for them and it's good for the outcomes.
Peter, you offered some tough rhetoric on marijuana as U.S. Attorney. Yeah. I wonder if your stance would be different as Attorney General and how you come down on the question of whether Rhode Island should legalize marijuana.
Yeah, I think we're right to be cautious about marijuana. Certainly, when I was U.S. Attorney, we were dealing with a different set of laws and a different set of issues. And the Department of Justice's policies, President Obama's policies, changed over time, as did ours. I think when we focus on Rhode Island, though, I think it is right to be a little cautious about it. I'm not concerned about adults using marijuana in the sense of the criminal justice system. What those health effects are, I'm not sure that we know yet. What really comes up for me is with children. I did 28 visits to high schools last year to talk about the opioid crisis. And when I went to do those visits, I always asked the student assistance counselors, what are you seeing? Because I wanted to hear from them. I mean, they're the ones in the schools, right? Every one of them was concerned about marijuana, I tended to focus on the opioids because that's killing people, and marijuana is making our kids less productive.
Yes or no on legalization?
Yeah, so that's a decision that people of Rhode Island are going to have to decide, Ian. But I'll tell you this, I think if we're going to do it, we've got to make really, really sure, that the principles are in place to make it safe. We keep it out of the hands of kids. We make sure that edibles aren't marketed to kids. And I'll say this is really important. Whatever revenue that we generate from marijuana, in my opinion, ought to go to two places first. And if it can't solve all these problems, it shouldn't go anywhere else. We ought to use every dime to solve this opioid crisis. Every person I speak to who's involved in it says they can't get treatment, or they can't get treatment long enough. I spoke to somebody yesterday who's on a waiting list of 29 people to get treatment. That's where that money should go.
Right now, the Attorney General's office is the adjudicator of public records and open meeting violations. Some have suggested, because that office has a cozy relationship with police, which is where many of the disputes come from, the AG's office should not be the arbiter of these cases. In Massachusetts, the Secretary of State's office handles it. There's a panel in Connecticut. Would you be open to shifting that responsibility to the Secretary of State's office if you were Attorney General?
Yeah, I'd be open to talking about it. I've sat with John Marion to discuss that issue. Sometime over the summer.
The head of Common Cause.
Yeah, head of Common Cause. I think that's a reasonable conversation to have. I haven't studied it closely. I'm certainly aware of the issue. But I would be open to discussing it, sure, if that seemed to be fair. And frankly, if that lent more credibility and transparency to the work that we're doing in law enforcement, I think that's a good thing. I think we can't be afraid to change the way we do business in law enforcement. We can't fight the war on crime from 20 years ago. We got to fight it in a way that makes sense today, and that's sort of part of it in my mind.
You say you're running as a Democrat because Democrats are the party of working people. How do you respond to Republicans who say Democrats have had a stranglehold on the General Assembly since the 30s and have not gotten the job done on the economy?
Oh gosh, that's a big question, right?
He asks those a lot.
Yes, Look, let me just say this. I'm a Democrat because I believe in the principles of the Democratic Party. Particularly when it comes from a perspective of law enforcement. I thought that the work that the Obama administration did, that I was a part of, really changed the way we looked at criminal justice in a real way. Really effective way. So when I look at the AG's office, I'm trying to focus on the mission of that office, and that's consistent with my values. Now, it's sort of in terms of broader democratic values, am I pro-choice? The answer to that is yes. Am I a believer in working families? Yes. Do I think health care should be available to everyone? Absolutely. So when I read, every minute there's another breaking news. As the Trump administration tries take steps that tend to drive people out of the health care system, that's a concern to me. I think everybody in this country should have access to health care. Massachusetts was able to do it before Obamacare. To me, that's really important to regular people. And that saves money in the long run. So on some of these broader issues, I hope that gives a sense of where I am.
Quick follow-up. I reported a while ago that you had talked to Democratic consultant Tad Devine. He played a big role in Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign last year.
Right.
Is he going to have a role in your campaign?
Yeah. Yes, he will. Tad and I have spoken. I expect that he'll be working with me.
In what capacity?
As an advisor and potentially do some other work, media work perhaps down the road. Frankly, as you get into politics, that's not my background, obviously. It's my first run for political office. It's good to have good people around you that can help.
Have you assembled the rest of your team yet?
Yeah, really working on that, yeah. I have a lot of old friends who I've known for a long time and aren't necessarily well known in political circles, but are good people who can help me walk this path I've decided to walk down.
I want to ask you about the state police. The relationship between the state police and the Attorney General's office is strained right now. The AG's office has come out publicly against the agency, particularly in 38 Studios. Does that trouble you?
Sure.
that relationship is strained? And do you think that the tension is just right now? You think it's fair?
Oh, I don't think it's ever good, and I don't think it should ever happen, frankly. Look, we live in the real world. I suppose it can happen from time to time. But look, I was U.S. Attorney for 8 years. I crossed over with 3 governors, 3 colonels, 2 AGs. There were times when I'm sure I frustrated them and they frustrated me. I mean, Governor Chafee and I had a number of issues where we weren't on the same page. But it never became personal. It was always professional. And you can't let personal issues get in the way of getting the job done. And if that's happening here, it shouldn't happen. The relationship between the Attorney General and the state police has to be tight. It has to be strong, because those are the 2 agencies that are going to do the bulk of the kind of work that's so important. The public corruption work that we've been talking about, that's where it starts, and that relationship has to be great.
You just made me think of one of the tensions you had with Governor Chafee was over a case that could have ended up as a federal death penalty case, and there was some wrangling back and forth. Where do you stand on the death penalty?
Yeah, personally, I'm against it. But when you take the oath to be U.S. Attorney, your job is to enforce federal law. That's your job. Just like when you take the oath to be Attorney General, you enforce the law of the state of Rhode Island. That's your mission. That's what you need to do.
What's your explanation for why the Trump administration is taking so long to fill your former position as U.S. Attorney?
Oh, I don't know. I've moved on from that.
What do you think, though? I mean, it seems really conspicuous.
I think it's. Look, I can't explain a lot of things in the Trump administration. I will say this: the acting U.S. Attorney Steve Dambrook is as good as it gets, and that office is in good hands.
But there's no indication he wants that job.
Oh, you'd have to ask. He was with me as my number 2 for years. He certainly knows what it takes if he wanted to do it. He could do it. There's no question about it.
You gave a shout out to your immigrant ancestors when you made your campaign announcements. I wonder if you think the Trump administration's travel ban on predominantly Muslim countries is the wrong way to go.
Well, there's been a lot of them, right? And the first one was patently unconstitutional. In fact, if Rhode Island had an international airport, I would have been, if I had to sign a piece of paper to try to defend that travel ban, I would have been gone way before March 10th. The president wouldn't have had to fire me on the 10th. It would have left before that. So, it frankly, they've all been bad. Some have been less bad than the previous ones. I think attorneys general around the country are still looking at the latest one, although I think Hawaii filed suit in the last week over that one. Here's my view on immigration when it comes to protecting our national security. We can't vet with a blanket. We've got to talk to individual people. That's the only way I know to do good vetting. And I will say that I went out to the Muslim community in Rhode Island time after time when I was U.S. Attorney. that community is a great community. They're Americans just like everybody else. They're raising kids, they own businesses, great people, really warmly welcomed me, and frankly, my eldest boy when we went out there to have an iftar dinner. So, we've got to be smart on immigration. We could talk about the dreamers and what I just think is exactly the wrong thing to do in terms of the Trump administration there. We've got to have a smart immigration policy. Secure our borders, have good vetting, but not do things that are counterproductive and don't make sense.
What letter grade would you give to Attorney General Peter Kilmartin for his job performance so far?
Boy, that's a tough question to answer because I don't see what he does on an everyday basis. But I will say this, that we did a number of cases with the Attorney General's office. Some of the ones that I ticked off earlier. And the Attorney General's office in those cases was a good partner. So in terms of what grade that should be given to the Attorney General, I mean, I think that's not really something that I should do. That's something for the people of Rhode Island to do.
Well, that could be a question you might face in a debate if there is one, if there is a challenger, which no one else has announced. Final question for you on Newsmakers this week. If you do have an opponent, will you debate them here on WPRI?
Absolutely.
That's a yes and a commitment. We'll hold that against you if you...
I love coming on with you guys, whether we're alone or with others.
All right. Democratic candidate for Attorney General Peter Neronha, thank you very much for joining us. My thanks to Ian Donis from Rhode Island Public Radio. Make sure you follow him on RIPR.org. I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.